I was just thinking, how does one even go about a subject like this? It's everywhere, literally. I thought I'd start with this very interesting, the manner in which this documentary is made. I've watched a couple of them. I'd like to believe that this is actually how the Constituent Assembly conducted themselves. Because now when you see Parliament, it's really a far cry in terms of how any kind of discussion, debates are kind of conducted. The kind of intellectual quality that you probably saw in just even half an hour, 45 minutes, it's 45 minutes, right? Is you are not going to find that in 5 years of watching Parliament now. So I think we've really fallen a very long way in terms of how constitutional debates, how the entire debates around making laws is taking place in this country. I'd say let's keep that in mind. That's something we really need to be concerned about. Now, coming to the question of law, I think this is a good kind of a foundation for one to understand how highly deliberated the question of land was. And obviously, it was meant to be, because if you can see, the lobbies are very clear. There is the Zamindar lobby that was hell-bent on protecting their interests. And then, of course, you had the socialists, you had the communists, Azhar Mohani, obviously one of them. And then you had people like the Congress who had a very different kind of entry points to how they understood land. But somewhere the entire imagination at that point, which I think is something that's a really necessary takeaway, is that with the Constitution was this imagination, was an understanding that the country is very unequal when you're talking about land ownership, access to land as a resource, and secondly that this is something that we need to address. That I think is something that's extremely clear. There was no doubt in the minds of the Constitution framers and all of them that this is something that we need to fix. Of course, they all came from their own kind of standpoints. There's one document that I really recommend to all of you. It's State and Minorities, Ambedkar's, which I think is a fascinating document, because actually what Ambedkar talks about at that time, carefully, I sound like a communist when I say this, is that he talks about the nationalization of land and the socialization of agriculture. That's his entire approach to how the land question can be sorted out. You read Gandhi, all of them, they have their own takes, but I found this to be something that's really quite interesting. Now, if you were to step back to now, or think about the land question today, how is it that one understands it? I think that's an easier way for us to try and get into this kind of a discussion. There were a few things that came to my mind. One of the things that Ambedkar also says, that land to the tiller. That fine, land to the tiller is an extremely important kind of goal. But then what happens to the landless laborer? That's the question that he poses over there. So if you look at land reforms basically was that. Land reforms was land to the tiller. The person who's actually cultivating the land is the person who should have title to that land. And you had a series of laws. It's not just the First Amendment. It's not just the abolition of the Zamindari system. You have land reform acts that came in literally every state, whereby previously tenants could actually get ownership of their lands. In states like in southern states where you didn't have too much of a Zamindari system, you had more of the Rayatwari system. You, again, through land reforms, through grants, etc., you tried to ensure that it was land to the tiller. So the entire idea was the land to the tiller. But I think the question that Ambedkar posed at that time, what happens to the landless laborer? That question still remains. And it's very interesting if you look at it, that there actually have been efforts by the state to ensure that lands also reach the landless laborers. So for them, basically it was the grant system. You had a series of policies of various state governments whereby agricultural land was granted to scheduled caste and scheduled tribe people. This is something that you've seen over the last 50-60 years. Land Revenue Act, you can still find some semblance of it, the Gomala, etc. can be given to them. But obviously the way in which that was done has really not sorted out the landless question. So I think one thing that I would keep for myself when we are discussing today is the question of landlessness. And here I am talking about rural landlessness. And if you were to look at some markers, and I think for this, Ambedkar again is somebody that we should really go back to, because he kind of saw the link between caste and land as something that was essential. You can't escape it. So landlessness is not just somebody being landless. Landlessness basically meant particular communities predominantly being landless, which is Dalit in the rural kind of context. With Adivasi communities, it's again a different ball game altogether. The way land is understood and all of those things. We'll come to that. So in the sense of, if you were to look at this project over the last 76, 77 years, and in trying to ensure that whether land would actually, whether this thing of landlessness, some kind of inequitable distribution of land, whether that could be affected, I think to a large extent that is something you would say it's been done because you have such kind of a fragmented landowning. But if you look at the kind of landlessness that exists, which is just remarkable, it's quite high, then you'd see that this is not a complete project. So I'm just parking that, that's one thing that we need to think about. The second thing is in terms of what happens within cities. So land, when you talk about, generally the idea is that, land is something, for agriculture. But land is also for a house. So how many people live in rented houses here? And you're born in Bangalore. Like if you're born in Bangalore and you still live in a rented house, then that says a lot about your earning capacity. You're total failure sometimes. But if you look at the city and you look at the entire thing of landlessness, how does one understand landlessness in the city? You probably say that, hey, everyone's got a house, so what is this idea itself? I'm saying that that's a very limited way of understanding it. What is the distribution of land within the city? Who owns the land in the city? Who decides access to land in the city? That I think is an extremely crucial kind of a question. And here I think this entire notion of, urban homelessness, which again is something that's rampant in our country. In a place like Delhi, you will have probably 200 to 300 deaths every winter of people who are living on the roads and who don't have shelters. And that's something that you'll find across the entire country. And then you have the question of those who are living in slums or in informal settlements. In places like Bangalore, there are this new formula of called the Nelle Badige slum. I don't know if any of you have heard about it. So if you see on the outskirts of Bangalore now, previously slums, old Bangaloreans will know this. Slums mean that Vayalikavan, there's one slum over here, next to that violin place, Chodaya Hall. The slum just adjacent to it. Then there's a slum just near that maternity hospital over there behind. The pockets of these very old slums that that one is very used to, or say the Ijipura slum or the slum in Koramangala. But now what you're having with increasing kind of rural, this kind of agrarian distress, which again, goes back to how much the land question has actually been able to deal with the agrarian kind of security. So because of increasing agrarian distress and because of migration, you have situations in Bangalore where entire communities come, and so they're probably doing, some kind of rag picking, or they're doing construction work, and some owner gives them a land. And it's more often than not, it's not even their land. It could probably just be government land that they, and it's called Nelle Badige. So the only thing that you're paying for is rent for that land. And you put up your own shack. There's no water, there's no electricity, there's no toilet, there's nothing that's given to you. But willy-nilly that person tells you to leave, you'll have to leave overnight. This kind of a thing, there are more than apparently maybe 800 to 1000 Nelle Badige slums that have come up around Bangalore. Some of these have been documented, most of them have been not. Now this I think brings us to the question of how many people actually own land in the city. And the percentage is something that will be quite remarkable. But I'm parking that. So that's the second thing that I feel, that's something that we need to talk about. The third aspect I thought, that we really need to kind of think about is this growing this kind of creation of landlessness. So there's a joke that, at least in our circles, that we have, that people say that land reforms have been folded up in our country. We say that land reforms are actually moving at a much more accelerated pace than ever before, except that now it's getting more and more concentrated in the hands of few people. That's the land reform. If previously land reform was to deal with landlessness, was to ensure some semblance of equality in the distribution of land, Now land reforms is about concentrating lands in lesser people's hands. I'll give you some small examples, whether it's, say something like an SEZ, or if you look at, say, the kind of Adani's or somebody, Ambani's just got land recently in Bihar for 1 rupee per acre. Adani, you know about the Bangalore International Airport? How much of land it went for the Bangalore International Airport? Anyone? It's probably the biggest airport in the world. It's 4,200 acres of land. And for the first 10 years, they paid a grand rent of 1 rupee per acre per year. Yes, and if you look at other...
Yeah, a small clarification on that, because I worked on the project. So this 1 rupee or whatever...
For the 10 years.
For 10 years.
Yes, I know.
They hardly earned any revenue. They were investing. Okay. So while we avail the services of the airport today, which is world class, okay, that is thanks to the investments brought by somebody else at their own risk. There was a promise that this airport will do well. That's fine. And it is actually a non-profit kind of an arrangement where they reap only some basic profits, and they have to plow back all the additional money that they make in order to compensate for the cost of flying.
I'll come to that. I mean, I've worked on the BIL case for almost 10 years, 12 years. And at least somebody, I'll just finish here. Somebody who's read the land purchase agreement, who's also read their CCA.
First of all, it's all lease.
Yes, 30 years lease, there's no problem at all. And the only thing that is collateral is nothing else but the land that has been given to them. So 10 years you pay 1 rupee, and then you have a kind of a thing that increases with the freedom that you can use how much of a land that you want for whatever you want. So you can have hotels coming up there, you can do whatever coming up there.
I mean, to be fair to the subject.
So, I'll just finish.
You can finish. There'll be a round of question answers, so please.
But I'd like this, I'd also like the state to also come up with such kind of policies where, say, land is given to people who don't even have houses in the city. You don't have a policy for that. If you look at the way in which land is actually thrown to corporates, somewhere, see, there's this belief, that, okay, giving it to a corporate is important because it generates jobs. That's a fair enough kind of opinion. But I think there's a counter opinion to that. When profits are privatized, risks cannot be socialized. So if you're going to say that, okay, all the profits that's coming out of this, let's socialize that, then I think it's fine. But here today we have a particular system, which is what neoliberalism is. Neoliberalism basically is that everyone will take the risk, but I will take all the profits. And which is why you have this increased concentration of wealth, which we have never seen before. An increasing kind of wealth and kind of income disparity, which India has never seen before. So anyway, the point I'm coming to is that how is it that lands are then taken? How are lands given? And here, of course, we have the Grand Land Acquisition Act, which is a 1894 colonial kind of statute, which finally got repealed in 2013, which is what our friend, the commentator, ends with. But of course, it's an act that's barely used. So the 2013 Act as a Land Acquisition Act is barely used. Some elements of it has now come into some of the state acts, like compensation. But still this notion that the state can acquire your land, eminent domain, that is something, that principle that doesn't go there. So if you look at various studies of how over the last 20, 30, 40 years, these kinds of expropriation laws have actually been used to kick people out of their lands. And then you'll understand that we are actually now in a reverse kind of a loop. So that's a third thing that I feel that we need to kind of think about. The fourth point that I really wanted to make was this entire thing of land, right? I mean, I've never owned land. But for me also now it's a matter of principle. I don't believe in private property, so I don't want to own land. But I do know that, land, it's a magic thing. I mean, somebody buys their house, like one of my friends, very dear friend of mine, he bought his house and it was excellent for him. He comes from a Dalit community, very poor, struggled his way up in life, literally slogged, and then got his house, and there's such a joy. And I think this is something that you will see in various forms, in various places. So for instance, if you remember recently, there was this very good struggle of the farmers in Devanali against land acquisition. And for them the thing was that this is not just a source of livelihood, there's a cultural bond also that you have with your land. And I think here, especially when you go to the to the tribal communities, Adivasi communities, it's a very different kind of a order in terms of how they view land, forest, and water. It's literally, it's woven into their life. They don't see a difference. I remember, many years ago, I used to work in Madhya Pradesh, and jowar is the staple diet over there, and it's beautiful. It's very tasty food. But people will tell you there in the Bhil community, they'll say that the jowar is the food of the land. So the grains is what you eat. The stalk is what the livestock eat. But the grains and the stalk, it contains the blood of the earth. And that's what gives us and them energy. So that's the kind of very symbiotic kind of a relationship, understanding that tribal communities have with regard to land. Now, if you look at how the entire question of land rights when it comes to Adivasis, it's something that's, we really need to hang our head in shame. These are communities, a lot of people say that, tribal should be thrown out because they are danger to the forest. I think it stands to reason that if there are forests only where there are Adivasis, then perhaps they are the only ones who are saving the forest. I think Vidyaranyapura was a forest at some point. It's still called Vidyaranyapura. You had forests in and around Bangalore. I remember as a young student, we used to go rock climbing in this place outside Banashankari. There's a very nice boulders over there, which now became part of some BDA layout over there. So this entire thing of forest, right, and how tribals have Adivasis have conserved forest.
I'm sorry.
How Adivasis have conserved forests and how how they've been treated. So if you look at, for them, the Indian state has been an extension of the colonial powers. And if the British kind of treated them as encroachers in the forest, the Indian state also treats them as encroachers in the forest, not as the people who were kind of nurtured and protected it. So for the longest time, Adivasis have had this running fight with the forest department in terms of how you control. I can talk for days on end of this because it's something that very dear to my heart. But one thing is for sure is that if Adivasis have any rights today, it's only by way of their entire kind of struggles. So you had this 2006 law that came into force. It's called the Scheduled Tribes and Other Traditional Forest Dwellers Recognition of Rights Act, which apparently has been brought in to undo a historical injustice. The law actually uses that phrase. But if you look at whether that law has been implemented to give land rights to Adivasis, it's a dismal kind of a situation that you see. In Karnataka, since we are all from here, one of the biggest struggles that's going on around land rights right now is in Nagarhole. I don't know if you have been following that struggle. We actually represent those tribals in court, and we managed to get stay on their eviction. But it's one of the most sordid kind of stories, in the sense that this is a community of Jenu Kurubas who are traditionally from these places. And their entire, again for them, because land is not just land. So, they're gods and goddesses, everyone is connected with that land. So even though they were thrown out of forest, they still had that kind of relationship. They'd go and do their puja only in this place. Those are the places that you will bury. You will still go to collect your jenu and all of your vegetables from this place. But they were still treated like encroachers over there. And now, and you had reports, Muzaffar Azadi report, 2 reports that have recognized that they have a right to this place. And still the forest department says that they have absolutely no right. These are rank encroachers. They need to be thrown out of this forest. And this is like the most basic fight that you see them doing. So when you talk about land rights in our country, and then you look at the question of Adivasis, that's like an extremely serious kind of a question that one needs to face. Connected with it is also the question of landlessness among Adivasis. There's a community called the Panyas in Kodugu, basically Yerava Panyaravas. There is one community that's really subjugated in every sense of the word. It is this community. So basically they work as laborers on the coffee estates in Kodagu. You don't own. There is no very few Paniyarava villages. So we do a lot of work with some of these communities. So there is no village of Paniyaravas. They are born on some coffee estate and they'll die on another coffee estate. And their entire life is spent working from one coffee estate to another. And in every coffee estate, obviously, the indebtedness is very high. It's a crazy amount of loans. So even if you take, say, 20,000, 30,000 rupee loan for some marriage, some festival, some celebration, or whatever it is, then the interest accrues and it becomes a very large amount, and then you end up paying that off. And then when you want to move, a Paniyarava wants to move from one coffee estate to another, basically that loan has to be bought off by another coffee estate owner. So a Paniyarava, if you meet a worker and they're confident enough in you, they'll show you a paper that they carry. It's just a small slip, which will have the name of the estate owner, it will have his phone number, and then it will have an amount written over there. The person's name is also not on that. So then if this Paniyarava wants to go to another place, he'll go give it over there, and that owner will talk directly to the other coffee estate owner. We don't know what's the deal that will happen over there. But then finally some kind of deal gets struck between these two coffee estate owners, and they will move lock, stock and barrel to the next coffee estate. Spend their entire life like that. Not an inch of land for them to stand on. Last year, we've been working with this community trying to organize, and so one of the ways in which they decided that they're going to get land is something that I felt was should share it with you. So they kept asking the government that, see, we don't have any land, we don't even have a village of our own, we don't even have a graveyard of our own, for God's sake. So please do something for us. And of course the state didn't do anything. So then a bunch of them, around 200 families, got together and decided that if the government is not going to give us land, we are going to go and take land. So they went and sat on government land. There was a lot of pressure that came on them, and finally the government came to its senses and now has decided that it's going to allot that land to them. But this is just an isolated story. Others over there are still in this. Last December, there was this a young boy called Ponnanna, Paniyarava Ponnanna, 18-year-old boy, who was shot dead. He was shot dead because the coffee estate that he works on, he was walking from there with his pregnant wife back to this line houses. They all live in these line houses. And he wanted to eat jackfruit. So they climbed this jackfruit tree, and this man Ponakonda Chinnappa, who was a Kodava, he came and he saw that a Yarava had climbed up the tree and was plucking jackfruit. So what was the punishment for that? He shot him dead on that tree. The gun that he used is some gun that they use over there. Basically 60 bullets entered his body and ripped his body apart. 18-year-old boy with a pregnant wife. And the reason why this happens is because of the kind of structure that exists over there, and there is absolutely no security. There's no land, there's no village. And when you had to bury this boy, and we had gone for this funeral that night, they basically brought him to a graveyard in another village which was around 30 kilometers away, because that's the only graveyard where the Paniyaravas can be buried. So even land to bury your body is not available to certain communities. So I think when we're talking about the land question, looking at also how adivasis kind of deal with it, I think that's the fifth component that I wanted to talk to you. The last thing that I really wanted to share with you is that, traditionally land has always been a source of cultural identity. Of course, also in terms of political, economic kind of identity as well. It gives you that sense of, of ownership, of dignity, so on and so forth. But the way you own land has always been different. So I've been part of, tribal communities where individual ownership of land is not a concept. You own it as a community. So you work the land together, you share the harvest. That's also a kind of thing. So this thing of an individual owner, that's not something that's that's necessarily dominant everywhere. But this question of land has always also been a source of conflict. So if you look at it particularly from the Indian point of view, if you look at the major struggles that have taken place outside of the freedom struggle in the last 200-300 years, you will find that it has been over control of land. So whether it's say the Santals and their uprising in the middle 18th century, or if you look at the Tebaga movement which happened in West Bengal, or the Telangana movement, the Naxalite movement, all of these were about the land question. So more and more what one sees is that if you look at this history, this entire history of conflict around land, my sense is that we are reaching a time in our country where this is going to become a very serious issue, if it already isn't. On the one hand, you have in rural communities increasing landlessness by virtue of, one is of course the kind of ownership is reducing. Secondly, landlessness is becoming rampant. The other thing is that you're seeing is within urban areas also this sense of kind of no ownership of land, absolutely no security. So I think if you have to sit and reflect about it today, given that we started off with what the Constitution kind of envisages, I think what we need to ask ourselves is to what extent have we been able to realize that in the context of land. And really, I think the answer is not too difficult. It's something that we have failed quite miserably, and that's something that we really need to see what we can do about.